My name is Monica Jameson. I spent 14 years at Alteryx Group as head of executive communications and crisis strategy. That title never meant much to people outside the system, but inside, it meant I was the person who got called when things stopped being manageable. I wasn't there to make noise. I was there to make sure it didn't spread. Scandals, near scandals, behavior that crossed lines without becoming headlines. I handled them all, silently, quickly, with the least damage possible. No one gave me awards for it. Most people didn't even know what I did. But the people at the top knew. When they said, "Has Monica seen this yet?" it meant something had gone wrong. And then Eli Greer showed up. He came in as the new head of communications. 36. Startup energy, polished charm, spoke in vision statements. We met twice in his first month. Both times I left with the same sense. He was in a hurry to be the loudest voice in the room. A few weeks later, he scheduled a one-on-one. It was positioned like a casual sync, but it wasn't. "We're realigning strengths across the team," he said. "You've built such steady trust here. I'd like that focused inward now. More culture, more tone setting, things that don't always get the attention they deserve." I asked what that meant for my role. He smiled. "We're calling it internal communication specialist. Less about hierarchy, more about clarity." Then came the salary cut. He called it a scope adjustment. Said it wouldn't affect how people saw my contribution. I said nothing, because I'd seen this play before. Stripping the title was just step one. The real change would come quietly. Access revoked, meetings skipped, legal threads dropped. And that's exactly how it unfolded. Within 2 weeks, I was no longer included in press briefings. Crisis scenario planning was handled without me. People I used to prepare now submitted public statements without even looping me in. I did the work they gave me: internal emails, employee milestones, event recaps, all neat, all harmless. I made myself easy to ignore, but I watched. I watched Eli push out messaging without vetting. Watched junior staff draft statements on things they didn't understand. Watched legal grow more reactive, less involved. I saw the structure start to hollow. Before they removed my admin access completely, I sent one last document. Subject: Legacy Watch List. Internal use only. Inside were 5 cases I had flagged in my final year. None of them active crises. Not yet, but patterns. Stories that had been closed too fast. People who'd walked away too quietly. I'd handled those things once, but the roots were still there. And if they were touched without care, something was going to come loose. No one responded. I wasn't surprised. That week, my name disappeared from the escalation map. And I let it happen, not because I was done, because I knew what was coming. When a system gets rid of its firewall, it runs faster, but it also runs exposed. And some things, they burn slow until they don't. They never said they didn't want my help. They just stopped asking for it. The week after Eli changed my title, things went quiet. Not dramatically, just subtly. Emails slowed, meeting invites dried up. Projects I used to own got handed off without a word. I wasn't officially out of anything, but I was no longer needed for anything that counted. I'd seen it happen to others. Now it was just my turn. I kept showing up, did the polite work, wrote internal highlights, drafted team updates. I even led a culture recap slide deck for the annual summit. I did it well. I wasn't bitter, not outwardly at least, but I kept track of what they were doing. More importantly, what they were missing. That's when I started building the folder, not because I had a plan, not yet, but because I knew what it meant when a company moves too fast and forgets how many things were being quietly held in place. I called it Legacy Watch List. 5 situations. Each one handled, technically, each one still unstable underneath. The first was a complaint from a junior employee. 3 years ago now, she had sent it to HR, CC'd no one. The subject line was clinical, the message unusually composed. There were no exclamation marks, no emotion. Just a detailed account of inappropriate comments and behavior from her direct manager. It had been addressed in-house, buried politely. The employee resigned, was paid out quietly, and signed a non-disclosure. The manager was relocated to a project in the Midwest. I never saw his name come up again, but every time I looked at internal transfers, I remembered her tone. People don't write that way unless it's true. The second item was more technical, a procurement anomaly. Someone in executive events had logged a high-dollar invoice from a vendor that never actually existed in our approved partner system. The receipt matched the budget. The event took place, but the vendor's address was a ghost office in Nevada. I raised it with finance briefly. They called it a filing mix-up and moved on. I didn't. The third was about media contacts. A reporter I'd worked with at our local business journal had reached out last fall, asking about an unnamed source alleging inappropriate use of company funds on executive travel. I knew the tone. He wasn't probing. He already had something. I called him, off the record, steered the conversation, and the story didn't run. The name behind the issue? I never learned. But a month later, I noticed a string of cleared expenses from an SVP's team that had all been marked urgent client recovery. No details, no trail. Just enough to make me watch the pattern. The last two were even less defined. Just conversations. Names that disappeared from systems with no formal announcements. A partner contract revised and re-signed within days. An internal survey where an entire team left their comments section blank. I'd been doing this long enough to know when people stop saying things, that's not peace, that's fear or fatigue. I flagged all 5. Not in a formal report, just in the document, a table, some context, a note on why each item still felt alive to me. Not accusations, not drama, just a quiet handoff from someone who still remembered what mattered. I sent it to Eli and to the head of legal. Subject, legacy watch list, internal only. No one replied. No thanks, not even a read receipt. I waited 3 days. Nothing changed. Then I saw my name removed from the escalation flowchart. Not officially, just one less row in the spreadsheet. That was enough. I stopped tracking after that. I'd said what I needed to say. They'd built a new wall without checking what it was meant to hold back. And I let them. Not out of spite, not even strategy. Just because I'd spent enough time keeping this place safe from its own blind spots. If they wanted to move forward without a memory, fine. But some stories don't stay buried. They just wait for someone careless enough to dig too fast. It started with a short headline tucked halfway down a business page. Not bold, not scandalous. Just a cleanly phrased story that reached further than anyone inside the building realized. A local journalist had found their way to an old exit case, one the company had once wrapped in silence. The facts were mostly intact. Misconduct reported, departure arranged, compensation issued. But the article framed it differently. It pointed to a culture of containment, not resolution. There was no byline, no interviews, just sourced phrases and precise details that couldn't have come from memory. Someone had shared a version of events only available to those who'd seen the original intake and the response behind closed doors. And it wasn't an accident. By the time the article was circulating through niche forums, internal messaging was already spinning. A 3-sentence company statement appeared mid-afternoon. It checked all the expected boxes: safety, values, continued commitment. But it lacked curiosity. It offered nothing beyond surface-level tone. I stayed quiet, watched the timing, watched who leaned away from their screens during meetings, watched whose faces stayed still when someone mentioned communications response alignment. Later that day, I saw an invite forwarded to me by someone in finance. A private sync to discuss narrative management. Every name on the list was new. They'd replaced the team, not the problem. I recognized one person, freshly promoted. She once asked me how we used to handle internal flare-ups. I'd given her a measured answer. You don't contain a fire by fanning it with language. She smiled. Took notes. I never saw her again after my role shifted. Now she was chairing the meeting. The next morning, a major media outlet picked up the story. Same structure, sharper language. They quoted from the original complaint, verbatim. Whoever had leaked it preserved the words exactly as they had been written years ago. No edits, no reinterpretation. That told me everything I needed. This wasn't about attention, it was about precision. Someone inside wanted the original truth to speak louder than the company's current voice. Eli's team issued a second statement. Longer, more polished, yet still hollow. They changed verbs, softened adjectives, and closed with a line about learning as we lead. By midday, a partner in legal glanced my way in the hallway. We hadn't spoken in months. His mouth opened like he meant to say something. Then he adjusted his tie and kept walking. That afternoon, a young associate from the communications team sent me a direct message. Just one question. Was there ever a playbook for cases like this? I waited a moment before responding. Yes, but it wasn't built on language. A minute passed. Nothing else came. I didn't push. She was already beginning to understand what her department no longer remembered. That evening, I reviewed the watch list again. Every item sat in the order I'd left it. Not as warnings, as forecasts. And now, one of them had arrived, exactly as expected. Quiet, measured, and immune to spin. This wasn't escalation, it was the system showing its cracks through the gaps no one thought would matter. And those gaps were growing every time someone chose appearance over understanding. I closed the watch list. The breach had already entered the room. Now it was only a matter of how far it would travel before someone dared to see it. The second leak didn't come with noise. It came dressed in numbers. A finance blog, known more for line item analysis than corporate gossip, published a quiet but surgical piece on vendor inconsistencies. I didn't need to finish the headline. It traced directly back to an old entry in the watch list. One I had flagged after a summit budget showed perfect formatting, clean approvals, and a vendor that didn't physically exist. No address, no record beyond our own systems. Everything else looked flawless. That was the point. The story didn't accuse anyone. It didn't have to. It quoted internal approval language nearly word for word. Someone who had touched the documentation wanted the original decisions to be seen in daylight. By noon, Eli's team had issued a statement across internal and external channels. Phrases like non-material discrepancy, vendor restructuring, and no personal benefit involved filled the screen. There was no admission, only polish. It was the kind of language that prioritizes impression over clarity, like dusting the floor while the ceiling caves in. Mid-afternoon, I passed Eli near the executive lounge. His steps were slower than usual, shoulders drawn higher than normal. He acknowledged me with a nod, a small, cautious gesture, and didn't stop. The smile was polite, practiced, and slightly delayed. He hadn't expected to see me, or maybe he had and hoped he wouldn't. That same evening, a former partner from finance messaged me. We hadn't spoken since before the title shift. She had once led the quarterly spend reviews. Straightforward woman, blunt when needed. Her message was simple: reopening 2022. They're asking where the flags were. That was all. She knew I wouldn't need more than that. No one had called for a formal review. Not yet. But legal had started assembling documents. Someone from strategy forwarded me a slide deck from a closed-door discussion. 4 talking points, each one crafted to distance leadership from legacy decisions. The last slide framed the issue as a gap in audit follow-through, a phrase that reveals more than it conceals. I remembered the meeting where that vendor was approved. The timeline had been tight. The summit date was locked. Logistics had to move. There was no bad intent, just unchecked urgency. That's how weak points are built. Not through fraud, through habit. Later that week, a junior comms associate walked past my desk on her way out. She hesitated, then backtracked a few steps. "Is there a way to know when a pattern stops being just an error?" she asked. I didn't look up from my screen. "When people stop asking the right questions," I said. She waited. I let the silence hold, then turned to face her. "And when the answers stop sounding like people," she nodded. Nothing more. No follow-up. Just enough time to show she'd heard me. At 5:30 p.m. sharp, the homepage refreshed with a new campaign. Team photos, motivational quotes, visuals from last quarter's offsite. The colors were warm. The lighting was perfect. Every frame said, "Look here." They had started building narratives to cover the tremors. That's how it always starts. Branding over reflection. Imagery over accountability. I'd written some of those lines once, not to hide the truth, but to buy time for it to surface cleanly. That was the difference. This time, the message wasn't stalling chaos. It was pretending there wasn't any. Inside the building, the floors were still polished, the smiles still rehearsed. But somewhere beneath it, the structure had shifted. No one named me. No one needed to. The words on the surface had begun to change, but the foundation underneath had stayed exactly the same. And that was the problem. The email came from a generic compliance alias, but the sender wasn't generic. I recognized the phrasing, the structure, the absence of punctuation where there should have been commas. It was Joseph from Internal Audit, someone who used to review my memos back when reviews still meant something. The subject line was diplomatic. Request for insight, historical approvals, 2021 to 2022. No directive, no accusation, just a quiet request sent late in the day, as if not meant to arrive until after most had logged off. It wasn't public yet, but something had triggered the audit committee. They weren't chasing the press stories anymore. They were chasing what lived behind them. I didn't respond right away. Not because I was unsure what to say, but because I knew exactly how they would read whatever I sent. So I waited. And instead, I reviewed my calendar week by week, starting from the first expense that didn't match its justification. By the end of the night, I had reconstructed enough to know what was coming. The problem wasn't the missing documentation. It was the presence of too many clean documents, perfectly aligned, triple approved, and unverifiable. That's what had triggered it. Not absence, overcompensation. 3 days later, the audit team booked a reserved room on the 6th floor. Frosted glass, blinds half drawn. They weren't ready to be seen, but they weren't hiding either. The room had been used once before for a vendor fraud case that nearly made it to the board. It hadn't been opened since. I noticed it was booked under a different name this time. Client Project Debrief. Someone had told them to stay quiet. Eli stopped by my desk that same afternoon. He hovered, half invitation, half deflection, then leaned slightly in. "Quick question," he said, eyes on the hallway behind me. "That vendor review protocol from last year, do you remember who owned it?" I met his gaze. "I do." He waited. I didn't add anything. After a few seconds, he nodded, smiled with only half his face, and walked away. It was the first time in months he'd asked me anything that wasn't rhetorical. Later that week, Joseph requested a call. I agreed to 10 minutes, no notes. He opened with context, legal boundaries, process assurances. I let him finish. Then I asked him one question. "Do you want answers or accountability?" He paused. "We're being asked for alignment." That told me what I needed to know. This wasn't just an audit. This was a shield, built to look like scrutiny, but designed to prevent it from hitting anything vital. Still, I gave him what he came for. A timeline, a list of approvals with context, decisions that had bypassed full review because of operational urgency. I didn't editorialize. I didn't hint. Just patterns, documented cleanly, left open for interpretation. He thanked me without meeting my eye. The next day, a managing partner from one of our investors showed up for a surprise walkthrough. She made no announcements, visited no scheduled meetings. She walked the halls, observed the rhythms, asked soft questions with hard implications. People mistook her visit for goodwill. It wasn't. When she reached my floor, she stopped by the coffee machine and lingered. We hadn't spoken directly before. She glanced at the branded mugs, then at me. "Did this place always run this quietly?" she asked. "Only when people want to be louder than the system allows," I said. She didn't press further, just smiled, a real one, and walked on. That evening, the internal portal issued a sudden update. The audit would expand to include expense governance and communications oversight. A short sentence at the bottom read, "Requested by the Office of the Chair." It had reached the top, not because someone forced it, because the system had been so careful hiding the mess. It accidentally told the wrong people it had nothing to hide, and now those people were starting to wonder what else had been perfectly cleaned. The first change came quietly. A scheduled leadership meeting was postponed with no explanation. Then, an all-hands newsletter missed its release cycle. A team known for its punctual precision suddenly lost its rhythm. I didn't need the announcements to know what was happening. I watched it unfold in expressions, in the way people walked slower past glass rooms, in how the printer near legal began jamming more often, paper stuck in feed trays because someone had rushed through too many copies of something that wasn't meant to be distributed. They were preparing for containment, not clarity. One afternoon, the EVP of operations, usually composed and bordering on bored, walked into the strategy pod unannounced. His tie had a faint wrinkle. He asked for a specific deck from last year, one I knew hadn't been referenced in months. When no one could locate it, he stood too still for too long, then left without a word. He wasn't looking for the deck. He was looking for what had been removed from it. That same week, an internal request surfaced for peer-level role clarity documentation. a harmless phrase that, in context, meant titles were being audited. I saw 3 mid-level directors walk out of HR with blank expressions and forced small talk. One of them held a printed org chart, folded twice like a resignation letter. People weren't being demoted. They were being softened, shifted sideways, reclassified, turned into questions rather than answers. Eli's calendar suddenly disappeared from public view. Meetings that used to be open for observation were marked private. His assistant stopped greeting people by name. When I passed by, I noticed a handwritten list on her desk with 3 columns: active, transitional, optional. I didn't ask what it meant. She didn't offer. The building had begun to divide, not by walls, but by intention. Some people adjusted. They leaned into false certainty. They repeated the official lines with extra confidence, as if saying them louder might turn them true. Others adapted differently. They asked quieter questions. They started arriving 10 minutes early to meetings, not to be productive, but to listen, to who was missing, to what wasn't said, to how carefully words were being chosen. I had once trained this company to manage crises through alignment. Now it was managing confusion through choreography. That week, someone left a binder outside the audit room, unlabeled, generic cover. Inside, printed call logs, expense codes, calendar timestamps. Not a bombshell. Not even organized. But enough to show someone was done protecting whatever they'd been told to protect. A partner from Risk texted me late one night. Just 5 words. "It's coming from the middle." I didn't reply. She wasn't asking for help. She was confirming what I'd already seen. By Friday, comms launched a new internal campaign. Return to intent. Photos of town halls, sound bites from mid-tier managers, messages about resilience and trust. But the building knew. Every person had already calculated what they were willing to carry and what they were preparing to drop the moment someone else took the lead. They weren't resisting the system. They were just letting it reveal itself, one coordinated silence at a time. That afternoon, Eli walked past me near the stairwell. He nodded again, this time slower, like he expected me to stop him. I didn't, not out of avoidance, but because I wanted him to keep walking, to wherever he thought answers still lived. He needed to feel that echo. He needed to notice who wasn't following. The handover didn't come with an announcement. It came in posture shifts, in approvals that bypassed Eli's office, in conversations that ended with, "I'll run this by Monica." It wasn't formal. It was functional. He still signed off on the big initiatives, but people had stopped waiting for him to initiate anything. They came to me for the logic, for the calibration, for what he used to provide before visibility became a liability. Someone in strategy began looping me in on things I was supposedly no longer responsible for. I didn't challenge it. I let the slide decks stack. I asked the questions no one wanted in writing, and people followed, not because of my title, but because I still made things make sense. Eli tried to reassert himself during a partner pitch. He redirected a point I'd made, then doubled back with a version that sounded more palatable. 3 minutes later, the partner asked me to clarify it. I did. Not with corrections, just with clarity. The room listened to me finish, then they moved on. Eli didn't speak again that meeting. He started taking more off-site days. His team said he was working ahead, but no one believed that anymore. Not when 2 of his direct reports started coming to me for alignment before greenlighting comms. A week later, an internal announcement named me advisor to strategy in a line item buried under a list of project updates. It didn't change anything. I had already been doing that role for months. Now it just had a line. The shift wasn't about ego, it was about gravity. Mine returned the moment his stopped pulling. That same week, a mid-level manager from HR stopped by my desk. She brought a folder, non-compliance records I hadn't seen since the original case. She said they'd been misfiled. I opened the folder, flipped through the pages. "Did you find this, or did someone place it?" She didn't answer. She didn't have to. That afternoon, legal sent out a revised protocol for historical case closures. For the first time, the language included the word reopen. It had never been there before. By the end of the week, I was reviewing messaging frameworks for 3 departments, none of which reported to Eli anymore. One of his deputies stopped by and asked if I'd seen the Q3 budget notes. I had. He said, "There's a line for your team." "I don't have a team," I said. "You do now," he replied. Eli made one last move before it ended. He requested an emergency session with the board citing alignment risks and role confusion. The language was stiff, formal, the kind of wording that doesn't invite discussion, just defense. He asked to meet alone with the chair. That meeting happened. No one shared what was said. But the next day, the chair requested a joint debrief with me present. It wasn't a demotion. It was an exposure. In that room, Eli tried to control the narrative one last time. He referenced structure, ambiguity, operational friction. The chair asked him 2 questions. What process failed? And what did you do to stop it? His answers were complete. Technically correct. Thorough, but hollow. Then the chair turned to me. I didn't bring notes. I didn't ask for more time. I just laid out the timelines, the patterns, the missed intersections that had been flagged but never traced. I ended with one sentence. When systems ignore correction, the consequences don't stay internal. The chair thanked me. Nothing else. Eli asked if there would be a follow-up. She said, "There's already been one." 2 days later, his calendar cleared. No announcement, just a line removed from the org chart and a generic thank you post from the corporate comms page. Someone forwarded it to me. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. The next morning, my inbox filled with questions. Not from executives, but from the teams. They wanted guidance. They wanted clarity. They wanted to know what to do next. That's when I realized the transition had finished. There hadn't been a vote, no real decision, just quiet collapse. And somewhere inside it, I had become the last structure standing. I didn't rush to accept it. I simply prepared the foundation that would keep it from falling again. The first few weeks after Eli's exit felt heavier than expected. Not chaotic, just weighty. People moved slower. Departments overcommunicated. Even silence had a density to it. No one filled his role, at least not officially. The office stayed dark. His nameplate disappeared. When a new hire asked who ran comms, someone just said, "It's realigned." I didn't step into the gap. I stayed where I'd always been, just slightly left of center, close enough to stabilize, far enough not to absorb the collapse. The goal wasn't to take over, it was to restore function. So I rebuilt what mattered first, cadence. We reestablished decision intervals, tightened cross-team loops, put back the audit steps that had been streamlined out during Eli's term. It wasn't revolutionary, it was responsible, and people responded. The noise faded, the room settled. One by one, the watch list items disappeared. Not because the risks were gone, but because someone finally owned them. Midway through Q1, I received a call from an external firm. They had worked with us years ago. The partner on the line said they were surprised to hear the company was still standing. I told him it was standing because no one had been trying to save its surface. We were fixing the ground. That same week, Helen came by my desk again. She'd been promoted in ops. She didn't say anything at first, just stood there like she needed to confirm something with her own eyes. "You look different in this seat," she said. "I've always been here," I replied. She smiled, left a folder, and walked away. Inside were cross-departmental protocols I hadn't seen in 2 years. Updated, annotated, signed off by every division. We'd rebuilt more than process. We'd rebuilt memory. That weekend, I took a long walk through the building. No agenda, just tracing the hallways I once moved through invisibly. The walls were the same. The colors hadn't changed. But the posture of the place had. Less rigid, less defensive. Systems don't forget failure, but they can be reminded what it feels like to function. When I passed the boardroom, the light was off. I paused at the glass, then kept moving. I didn't need that room anymore. The last entry I ever added to the watch list wasn't a risk, it was a lesson. I wrote, "Systems erode when names replace principles. Restore the principle and the names become irrelevant." By then, no one called it the watch list anymore. It had evolved into a framework, a logic spine. People added to it, refined it, didn't even know where it started. That was the point. It no longer needed me to exist. One morning, I received a calendar hold. No title, just initials I recognized. It was from the chair. The meeting was short. She asked how the transition had stabilized. I explained what we kept, what we scrapped, and what we refused to define until we understood it. Then she asked if I wanted the role, the one Eli used to hold. I didn't hesitate. "No." She didn't flinch, just nodded. Smart. We both knew the power had already moved. That afternoon, I walked through the open plan floor where comms, strategy, and ops now sat side by side. Someone had posted a note above the coffee station. The system sees. So build like it's watching. It wasn't signed. It didn't need to be. On my desk sat a small envelope. Inside was a card. No message, just a single paperclip and a date. I smiled. Someone from legal had a sense of humor. I tucked it into my drawer. Years ago, I would have framed it. Now, I didn't need the proof. I packed my things that evening, not because I was leaving, but because I'd finally stopped holding space for something I never needed permission to lead. When the lights dimmed and the building softened into its after-hours silence, I took one last look across the floor. No fireworks, no headlines, just systems humming quietly, rebuilt, rebalanced, and still watching.